afternoon, everyone. I'm going to call the meeting to order. Bienvenue à la réunion numéro 39.
Welcome to meeting number 39 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics. Pursuant to the order of reference of Thursday, February 12, 2026, Section 14.1 of the Lobbying Act, and the motion adopted by the committee on Wednesday, September 17, 2025, the committee is resuming the statutory review of the Lobbying Act.
I'd like to welcome our witnesses for the first hour today as individuals. We've got Ian Stedman, who's the Associate Professor, School of Public Policy and Administration in York University, and Laurie Turnbull is here, who's a Professor, Faculty of Management at Dalhousie University. Mr. Stedman, I'm going to start with you. You have up to 5 minutes. Good to see you in person. And please address the committee for 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you. Good afternoon, members of the committee. Let me start by thanking you for inviting me to contribute to this review of the Act. As has been noted by several of you and your guests, a serious review of the Lobbying Act is long overdue, and hopefully this process will be very productive for all of you. There's a lot more attention being paid to issues of ethics and influence than I think many of us would like, and so it has become impossible to look the other way lately. Now, just so you know a bit about me, because I know there are some new members, I'm a former employee of the Office of the Integrity Commissioner of Ontario, where from 2010 to 2015 my role was to administer the Members' Integrity Act and to backfill in other mandates. As Commissioner Motherwell noted in her appearance, that office also handles lobbyist registration, disclosures of wrongdoing, and public service ethics. Everything under one roof, you might say. Because of my professional experience, I'm often called upon now to comment in the media about public sector ethics and accountability. I should note then that my perspectives are very much informed by my experience sitting in the room and doing the administrative work on the administrative side. I believe in fulsome transparency because I want to encourage public trust and good faith civic engagement. And I believe that if information is available to the public, they might just consume it in ways that help us to protect our democracy. So I'm a bit of an optimist in that sense. For my opening statement, I'll make a series of quick recommendations, most building on the recommendations of others who have appeared before you. First, though, I want to situate my remarks by saying that a lobbyist registry to me is not simply about weeding out the bad actors by forcing them to make their engagements visible, but is about giving us the tools we need to better understand how governments make decisions. This includes who influences those decisions and how. Echoing Commissioner Bélanger, I think we focus too much on who gets paid to influence and how much time they spend trying to influence as being indicators for who should have to register. As legislators, I encourage you to trust that the Commissioner's office will use its expertise to find ways to lessen the administrative burden of registering and reporting, and to focus your efforts on putting rules in place that strive first and foremost for what is right and what serves the regime's ultimate goals. I do teach public sector ethics at York University, and I tell my students that a policy line has been drawn separating lobbying from the idea of registrable lobbying. This is always a bit confusing for them, and I tell them that just because you aren't required to register, it doesn't mean that you aren't in fact lobbying. So as you might imagine then, I fully support the Commissioner's recommendation number 1 to do away with the significant part of duties threshold. Keep it simple. Figure out any specific exceptions that you want, worry less about inconveniencing people, and put rules in place that serve the purposes of the Act. I'd also like to note my support for making sure the designated public office holder designation is doing the work we want it to do. The regime's goal is to capture communications that are being made in an effort to influence those who themselves hold power or who occupy positions of influence. Just because you are not appointed under Section 128 sub 1 of the Public Service Employment Act does not mean you are not in a position of influence or power. I would strongly encourage the committee to make clear recommendations about how wide this net should be cast. Similarly, Commissioner Bélanger's 12th recommendation pushes back against the idea that registrable communications should only be those that were arranged in advance. I can't tell you how many times I've had a casual conversation with an MP or a policy advisor at the airport or at a conference. I get to choose whether I approach them and press them on a policy issue or not. And if I'm someone who works in the policy world and who has an employer, then I should know the lobbying rules. This committee shouldn't have any sympathy for me having to file a quick report after a communication if that's how I choose to engage during those kind of impromptu encounters. In terms of penalties and other compliance measures, my answer is yes, changes are needed. It's harmful for public trust in her office that Commissioner Bélanger has to be so secretive about her investigations and that she has to refer to a peace officer when she believes that a person has committed an offense. Have her office survey other jurisdictions and provide you with a comparative analysis of what is being done across the country and in other Commonwealth states. I would strongly encourage you to suggest amendments to the Act to allow for a range of additional compliance measures, which I know you've heard from almost everyone. Finally, I want to return to my experience in Ontario, where everything is under one roof. I realize that conflicts of interest, lobbying, and whistleblowing are all separate offices at the federal level, but it is impossible to deny that they can have lots of overlap on some files. I know we like these offices to have operational independence, and I know it can be controversial to make big changes to them, but I would encourage this committee to speak with the Ontario office, again, about its experience administering multiple mandates under the wide ethics and accountability umbrella. Is it beneficial? What are the challenges? Are there greater efficiencies to be gained? If you're going to give consideration to Commissioner Bélanger's request that a new funding mechanism recognizing and reinforcing the independence of her office be established, then I would encourage you to also think about how a new funding mechanism could be used to help improve structural independence and operational effectiveness across accountability offices. I saw that the idea of combining offices was briefly mentioned in last week's conflict of interest report. So I imagine a larger study would be in tow, but I think that's probably something you can get away with recommending in your report. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Stedman. Dr. Turnbull, 5 minutes. Please address the committee.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I was with you back in October to talk about the Conflict of Interest Act, and so it's really nice to be back with you in this room again. So I've studied public sector and political ethics for a long time, and the two pieces of legislation, the Conflict of Interest Act and the Lobbying Act, are interconnected and are integral parts of the ethics regime, which is aimed at ensuring transparency and ethical decision-making for Canadians and regulating the relationship between government and actors looking to engage with and influence government. I have a specific interest in the post-employment rules that are in place for public office holders when they leave government. I've listened to the testimony of Ms. Bélanger, the Commissioner of Lobbying, and I've read her recommendations. I understand her desire to move to a system of registration by default, so that all lobbying activity is captured by the Lobbying Act. This would enhance transparency and compliance. I don't believe there would be any unintended consequences in the form of suppression of lobbying activities or the creation of an undue burden on organizations, as compliance with reporting requirements are not too onerous, even for a small organization. I also agree with her recommendation that monthly reports should include all communication, not just those communications that are arranged in advance and initiated by a lobbyist. So I know we're going to talk about Ms. Bélanger's recommendations in more detail, and so for now, I would just make one additional comment that has been on my mind about this whole thing. The Conflict of Interest Act and the Lobbying Act are entwined, and they work toward mutual purposes relating to ethics and transparency. As we undertake a review of the Lobbying Act, I think it's also important to note that there is a period of change and reflection inside Canada's public service more broadly. And so, as you know, there are reductions happening through early retirements, through job cuts. There's also a simultaneous effort to bring in new talent, new expertise, new people. And particularly as we grapple with the kinds of issues that we're grappling with now with respect to trade diversification, economic growth, AI, all kinds of things. We're obviously in a period of a lot of change, and it's completely understandable and appropriate that we would want a public service that can respond to those kinds of challenges. We need to move as the world is moving. There have been media reports of heavy recruitment from the banking and financial sectors, including to the Major Projects Office and elsewhere. I'd flag that this has already created and will continue to create heightened awareness of the circumstances around these appointments. Will such appointees be captured under the Conflict of Interest Act or the Lobbying Act, and what are the implications either way? Let me say that I don't think we should adopt practices that make it difficult for a public service to recruit such expertise. I think the opposite, actually. I think we need a public service that is nimble and fit for purpose and is able to respond to the challenges we have. I don't think we should be allergic to finding ways to draw in the right people. It would be a shame if we were. But I would say that the moment we're in right now invites, I think, not just a narrow look at the Lobbying Act as it is and what might we need to change in terms of loophole closing, whether we want to cast a broader net or a net that catches more things. Yes, we might want to look at that, but I think we also need to think about what is the broader conversation about the relationship between government and business and how government wants to recruit people and what sorts of obligations we want to put on them and whether that's meeting the goals that we have. So thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
Dr. Turnbull. We're going to start, on va commencer avec le premier round de
We're going
questions.
to start with our first round of questions. Mr. Hardy, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you for being with us. I hope that you are hearing interpretation. Is everything working? I see one. Yes? Okay, good. Thank you very much. You're very aligned with what we're hoping to get here. You talked about transparency and accountability. You've said that we are more than overdue to carry out this review. I would like to share a situation with you, and I would like your opinion on whether or not it is lobbying. As you said, Dr. Turnbull, everything is connected. So we have an advisor to the Prime Minister who is not subject to the Lobbying Act, but he is also director for a company that has investments in many different fields. So this person is advising directly, not subject to legislation. Do you believe that this could be considered lobbying? And my question is for both witnesses.
Okay, so from what I understand, the person's working for the Prime Minister, their advisor, they have investments. If they're lobbying, what are they lobbying for?
Aider les compagnies dans lesquelles ils ont des investissements à mieux performer.
They're trying to help the companies that they work for by having an impact on public decisions. Do you believe that's lobbying?
Trying to make representation to the government on behalf of something else or someone else, then that's lobbying.
Parfait. Merci.
Great,
Monsieur
thank you.
Stedman.
Mr. Stedman?
The perspective that if they're being asked for their opinion on the specific topic that just so happens to be related to the company that they were known to be associated with before being hired on as an advisor, that wouldn't qualify as lobbying because they're being asked directly for their particular input on that topic. Now, if it's outside of the purview of what the advisory role is and it could benefit those companies, then yes, I agree. That would be lobbying.
Parce que j'ai l'impression que des fois, on a de la misère à faire la
I get the
ligne.
impression that sometimes it's a fine line between lobbying and sharing interests or saying, I think that we should focus on a specific sector, but it just happens that we have shares or investment in that sector, and in a way we're influencing a decision in a way that benefits us. So often lobbying is described as being a bit opaque. We know that we need to have people representing industries. As MPs, we don't know everything about everything. So it's important to have people explain issues to us for specific industries to see how we can help them and how we can make decisions. I think that's fine. But when we're dealing with major decisions that align with private interests, I think that could clearly pose a problem. And that's something that you would agree with, if I understood correctly.
I definitely think it's a fine line, but you're never going to be behind those closed doors to know what that conversation is. And so you're speculating that perhaps the conversation sometimes veers left and veers right and doesn't stay centered. It's a fair speculation. That's your job as opposition to ask those questions, right? But I'm not so sure that you look at this. Prime ministers and ministers have advisors, and those advisors have expertise in the areas they need advice. And they have that expertise because they have histories in those areas or current engagements in those areas. The question is, do they stay on point? Do they stay centered on the actual project?
C'est le problème qu'on rencontre. Puis en fait, c'est justement...
Well, and you said it. There are a lot of changes, a lot of adaptation happening, and we need to adjust our legislation to face these new realities. But if we're looking for transparency, we need to be able to have that. So if it's hidden discussions that we don't understand, or if there's an appearance of a conflict of interest, whether it be lobbying or a real conflict of interest, should we not have more mechanisms to better understand how these decisions are being made? Or perhaps avoid being in a situation where Canadians might think that decisions are being influenced by corporations who are wealthy, and so you might understand what I'm getting at. So how can we better define that line? How can we be transparent and have a structure in order to protect Canadians and their tax-paying dollars?
To the rest of the translation before I jump in. Yeah, I mean the transparency piece is really what we're trying to get at with the Lobbying Act. And so I start from the perspective that people are acting in a way that is ethical, and lobbying is an ethical activity. And it is completely healthy in a democracy for people outside government to want to influence government and to want to inform government about how their policies and their decisions would affect people. And that's the essence. I think that's the essence of lobbying. It's okay to want to influence government. In fact, it's better if people want to try to influence government. We have a healthier democracy that way. So the point of the lobbying rules is about making sure that people understand what sorts of opinions are coming to the government and making sure that the space around the government is not secret, so that we know if, when we can see a government taking a position, going a certain way, we have an understanding of who's spoken to them about this, whether they have been heavily lobbied by one side or another. If there's a sense that maybe the decision was directed in an undue way by somebody who's had more access to the government perhaps than you would think they did. We want to make sure that that's not a secret. It's about putting a light on all of it so people understand.
De même pouvoir même aller de manière rétroactive.
Should it be retroactive as well? To see who people were meeting with, what interests they had, the relationships. Perhaps we could better understand the kind of decisions that they would be making with taxpayer dollars. It would be good to know how many people lobbied them in the past. I think in your opening remarks, you talked about disclosure, so a retroactive disclosure, and being able to see what kind of lobbying activities happened before somebody's mandate. Is that something that you could speak to?
You can provide a very quick response. Peut-être, Monsieur Hardy, on peut
I don't
retourner
think-
sur cet enjeu, mais a quick response, Mr.
I don't think we want to put the onus on the members. I think what you could get here as a pragmatic solution is ask the commissioner to put out an advisory opinion explaining that even if you are hired as an advisor to the Prime Minister, this is where the line is drawn. This is what is lobbying and this is what is not lobbying. And if you are lobbying, you must register. Advisory opinion would be very helpful.
Dame la Pointe, 6 minutes.
Ms. Lapointe, you have 6 minutes. Microphone, please. Thank you for participating in this very important study. I listened closely to your opening remarks. I just want to reread my notes here. And this question is for Mr. Stedman. So you're saying that those who are being paid need to be registered as lobbyists. And you also said that you could be lobbying without being paid. So following the commissioner's recommendations, how would you like to see people register to the lobbying registry?
Question. I am not as concerned about who's getting paid to influence as I am about who is influencing. The point I was trying to make is that if we over-concern ourselves with who's getting paid and how many hours they're trying to influence, then we're losing, I think, what the point of the act is. And the point is transparency so we can understand who is influencing. I believe that Commissioner Bélanger made some recommendations about how people would register. So if you're a member of a board, should you be registering as a consultant or as part of the organization? Those are interesting recommendations that I'm sure you're all considering. I don't think that being paid per se, like a salary, should be a defining factor in whether you're required to register. There's all sorts of people who advocate on behalf of organizations for all sorts of different ways of being compensated or quid pro quo, right? I think that's probably a conversation you need to have with specific examples in front of you.
You
made reference to an impromptu meeting at the airport. Would that be something that you would register?
I was at an airport standing in line beside an MP, it's happened before, and I asked them a question about a policy issue relevant to my employer or someone whom I had an exchange of benefit with, right, for some reason. I would think that you would be required to register. That's an attempt to influence on a policy issue. If I say, how are the kids, I don't think you need to register, right? But yes, absolutely. I think that when we say, let's reduce the threshold, I think that's what we're saying.
Merci. Madame Turnbull.
Thank you. Ms. Turnbull, you piqued my curiosity. You talked about public servants, that some are in pre-retirement, early retirement, and there are new people coming in with new responsibilities. Can you elaborate on that? Were you speaking to training, for example? I would like to understand what you meant.
I think that in this moment, the public service is in a real need for reform, and it's one of the only times over the past, I don't know, 30 years, maybe even more than that, that we're not actually engaged in a formal reform exercise of the public service, right? So we're not doing Blueprint 2020 right now. We're not doing La Relève. We're not doing any of those things. We're in a moment where actually the government deeply needs specific things from the public service, and we're actually not in a conversation in a formal way that is led by the clerk about what do we need the public service to be doing. And so what's happening is that these cuts are happening, and it's quite significant, and everybody's being affected by that. And even the people who are staying, even the people who manage to hold on to their jobs, are still affected by this broader piece of there are people losing their jobs. There are Surlo competitions, and yeah, I won it, but I still had to compete against my colleague, and now this feels kind of awful. And you made me Surlo, so maybe that means you don't trust me. And so we're teeing the public service up for actually quite a crisis in confidence here. At the same time, whereas we're not giving any clear direction about what we want this organization to do. And I think at the same time, the fact that they're making these significant cuts indicates that the government wants something different from the public service, and they're looking for specific skills. And I think the public service needs to hear how they fit into the government's agenda. What do you want us to do? How can we be helpful? How can we fit into this? And so I think part of the answer to that is that the Prime Minister is clearly looking for people who have expertise in finance and economics and AI and in growth and that sort of thing. And so it's fine to be, for me, it's okay to be bringing people in from the outside, because I think that makes for a more robust public service. But I also think that there needs to be questions answered about how do you take the permanent public service and plug it into the implementation of the government's agenda. That's exactly what the public service is supposed to do. And so what's our plan for that, right? And I think that we might be at a point now where we need to be thinking about what kinds of rules might apply, to if there's going to be a lot of recruitment in, and there's potentially a revolving door situation where you've got people coming in from banks for a year, 2 years, then they're going to go back out, and they've got all kinds of information about what the government's doing, how decisions are being made, who are the powerful people. They're going to go back out. What rules are going to apply to them? And if the answer is none, because they're not caught in the Conflict of Interest Act because they're not public office holders, then you're going to get people saying, well, why am I caught in this? Because that person was much closer to the center of power than I was, and they don't have to obey any kind of post-employment rules. They can go back to their bank and do what they want. And so we're setting ourselves up for a problem if we don't address those things, and it doesn't have to be a problem. And if I sound like I'm saying we shouldn't be recruiting from the banking side, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying we need to be mindful about it, because we do have rules that govern that door that people go in and out of when they're moving from their expertise to in and out of government.
Merci beaucoup. Très
Merci,
apprécié.
Merci, Madame Lapointe.
Thank you, Ms. Lapointe. Ms. Gaudreau, you have 6 minutes, and welcome to the committee. Thank you, Chair. I was here from 2019 to 2021, and I remember having certain discussions regarding whether or not we had what we needed on a legislative basis to ensure that there was due diligence and proper governance. And what happened? Well, the pandemic. I was here when we were dealing with the We Charity scandal, and there were other things that happened, of course, including, and I saw this in one of the recommendations, to limit to 5 years for a public office holder. I don't know if that brings anything to mind with Baylis Medical, for example, a former Liberal MP. It hasn't been 5 years, and suddenly there's an opportunity because he's got a background in engineering, and so he was going to benefit from that. And he prospered, and we're making recommendations here, but what potential sanctions, monetary penalties could be implemented. There are so many things that happen, and there's a gray area. Do you believe that if we report and we send this over to public safety, if we have significant enough penalties? And I was here with when Bill Morneau and that $48,000, I tabled a motion for him to step down, and we didn't have the opportunity to speak about it because he left. He hadn't recused himself, and he knew he was wrong. There are things happening right now. We don't, it's not seeing the light of day. And people say, yes, I recuse myself, but what do you think of these penalties, these sanctions that could stop such problematic activities?
This sounds like a conflict of interest law question as opposed to a lobbying act one. And I think what we've historically done is said a report comes back to Parliament underneath the code, and a report comes back to the Prime Minister underneath the Act, and the decision is made by the Prime Minister, and the House makes the decision under the code. Recommendations are only made by your commissioner. There aren't penalties. We've historically been reluctant to give these officers of Parliament, or agents, I guess as we'll call them, power to do things that are your responsibility, which is disciplining members. So I don't know that you're going to have any sort of consensus on giving a commissioner the power to fine in any real sense, and in a punitive way. Right? What they have now is $500 administrative monetary penalties that your ethics commissioner, your conflict of interest and ethics commissioner can impose. But I think we all know that that's not really much of a disincentive, $500. Maybe the question under that regime would be, should that penalty be greater? But it's really up to all of you to vote in the House about disciplining and censuring one another. It's not, I don't know that you want to give that to the commissioner. We haven't historically wanted to.
C'est d'ailleurs, entre autres, ce qui avait été souligné.
That's something that was raised by the Privacy Commissioner. This was raised at another committee regarding EVs and Chinese EVs. The Privacy Commissioner was saying that they did not have the means in order to focus on prevention. And in that case, we were talking about lives that would be impacted. Yes, lives behind the wheel, but we see that there are not only impacts when elections come around. There are a lot of recommendations. Are you aware of all of the recommendations made by the Commissioner? Yes? Okay. Which one of these recommendations is essential to this reform?
A quick answer. I believe there should be a real conversation about the penalties, the idea that the commissioner can do more in response to complaints coming in. I think you saw from her testimony that that's a real sore spot, and it's a real point of criticism that she gets from the outside looking in, is why aren't you doing anything? And she has to explain over and over again that she doesn't have the power to do much. So I think if you wanted to enable her and empower that office, thinking more clearly about administrative monetary penalties or naming and shaming, like Commissioner Motherwell told us in Ontario, having a registry of people who have actually violated and kicking them off from lobbying for 3, 4, 6 months. Something like that would be progressive and would really help her inspire others to comply, I think.
Et Madame Turnbull, il me reste 30 secondes.
And Ms. Turnbull, I have 30 seconds left.
Actually, really interesting, the recommendation that the lobbying commissioner has made around the default being to register. I think that's probably the most impactful thing in the report, and the thing that I would, if I could have one thing, I would say it would be that one, because I think that you do get into a kind of subjectivity around, okay, is this a substantial part of what I'm doing? And you're actually kind of asking people to make a judgment about whether they're registered or not. And one of the reasons I like this recommendation, apart from the clarity around it, is that lobbying is not a bad thing. It's okay to say, yes, part of my work is to be a lobbyist, right? And this is what I'm doing. Just do it. Just register. It's fine. And that way you're not trying to figure out, where it could, because I completely understand what she said when she was here, and she said she goes to lobbying day on the Hill and she sees people who haven't registered. That kind of a public clearly there are people who are identifying publicly as lobbyists, but are not registering.
Thank you.
You have a disconnect that is going to make people doubt the whole system.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Turnbull. Merci, Madame Goudreau. On va commencer avec le deuxième tour.
We're going to move on to our second round of questions. Mr. Hardy, you have 5 minutes. Back to me. There are a lot of elements that are very interesting. We have interactions with elected officials, and they are spending taxpayer dollars. I think that all of that needs to be more transparent. Earlier, you mentioned that we are in a paradigm shift within the country and abroad. Often when we ask questions here, we would get the impression that we're targeting a single person, but there are more and more people from the financial sector coming into politics, and our legislation needs to be robust enough to cover these cases. So we're dealing with, for example, a prime minister with a lot of ties in the private sector, with shares and investments throughout the world linked to performance. Do you find it normal that in this international and national change that we're asking these questions on who's lobbying him, and is it not overdue that we focus on all of this?
I mean, I think that it's important to think about what you want to get out of the Lobbying Act, whether it's meeting, whether the regulations are meeting the goals that you have. And I don't think it's so much about Prime Minister Carney and his own individual. To me, this is not about him and whatever his holdings are. That's not the issue. The issue is the fact that there are people coming into the public service that have been recruited to do this work that I think, have been recognized as uniquely suited to do at a time where we need to build these skills very quickly, not over a period of 2 years where you can hire and skill up and all that. They want to bring them in right now. And so if we're doing that, what do we expect of these people? Are we saying that you have to observe a post-employment freeze, a cooling off period before you go back to your bank? And if so, they're probably not going to want to do it.
La transparence, c'est clairement ce que tu demandes. Tu veux de la
transparency is what you're requesting. And I'm not speaking about Prime Minister Carney. I'm just speaking of this case in particular. We want more transparency. We want to ensure that our systems are ready. We talked about if there was to be a fine, could it be proportionate to the problem, or is it going to be just $200? We need to make adjustments depending on the reality. We don't want to only catch more fish. We want to ensure that if there is a serious infringement, that both the Ethics Commissioner and the Lobbying Commissioner have the opportunity to stop it. Do you agree?
Administrative monetary penalties are not something that's not an appropriate response to actual wrongdoing. Mm-hmm. That's somebody's late filing. They're late filing all the time. So you're going to say, come on, stop it. We're going to charge you $500. Knock it off. File on time. But if you're talking about somebody who's actually trying to do an end run around the rules, $500 is not going to do anything. And also, if you're talking about someone who's actually meaningfully compliant, right, and made a mistake, what $200, $500, that doesn't matter either. What do you?
Non, mais on est d'accord. Dans le fond, ce qu'on veut, c'est qu'on veut des amendes.
I agree, but we want proportionate fines. If I'm late by 3 days, I don't think there should be an insignificant fine. But Mr. Stedman, I have a question for you. In the Major Projects Office, after a year, we're seeing that it costs $42 million and not a single project has started. And we talked about needing people with knowledge in order to move these projects along quickly. Do you believe that there needs to be more transparency to see who lobbied the federal government, how these projects are being chosen, how we chose a company over another? Should there be more transparency for the Major Projects Office that would be relevant for ethics as well?
The question correctly, I believe that this has been one of the recommendations made about whether communicating with government about contracts ought to be something for which we register as lobbyists. And I think the consensus across...
Ce qui n'est pas le cas présentement, juste être clair. Là.
It's not the case right now, correct? If we're asking for a contract, there's no registration.
is that it ought to be, unless there's a national security implication, in which case you probably have to have exceptions carved out. But if people are coming to government saying, give me that contract, and it's not subject to a transparent, what's what I'm looking for, process, procurement process, then yeah, I would argue, I would take the position that it ought to be registered as lobbying, yes.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Stedman. Merci, Mr. Hardy.
Thank
Mr.
you,
Els-
Mr. Hardy. Mr. Al-Sood.
Chair, Mr. Stedman, you mentioned knowing that there are new members on this committee. I am one of them. It's a privilege to be here, particularly given that we're speaking on a topic that I find is so fundamental to our democracy. Our lobbying regime is in many ways the gold standard, but there are always improvements to be made, and that's exactly the point behind the statutory review. I thank you both for taking the time to be with us today. One thing we hear often is that not all voices in the lobbying space have the same capacity. Larger, well-funded organizations can dedicate significant time and resources to sustained lobbying efforts, while others like physician groups or healthcare professionals are often balancing this work alongside demanding responsibilities like patient care. How do we ensure that groups with less time and fewer resources, like doctors or smaller professional organizations, can still effectively be heard as we conduct our review of the Lobbying Act, and potentially look to harmonize rules between consultant and in-house lobbyists and corporations and organizations?
One of the things that we've heard in this committee's review so far is that there are ways to do this. I mean, we've heard that British Columbia and Quebec are leaders as far as their lobbying laws being modernized. You can default register and then carve out exceptions for small organizations or startups or organizations that have a certain amount of money, not or size. That's a possibility, so that you don't disincentivize not-for-profits getting involved in advocacy. And that's been done. You could ask your lobbyist registrar or your commissioner of lobbying to provide you with a comparative analysis of what's happening across the country. You have that. You have those examples already. So it's not like you're reinventing the wheel. You're just deciding whether you want to catch up with those who are moving quickly.
Speaking of the BC Lobbying Act, it's been declared as a gold standard, and we've heard many witnesses praise it. Could you speak to that model and whether there are elements of it that Canadian regime could learn from and potentially implement?
That model got modernized because the New York Times took it to task. So I think you don't want that. So I would say I'm not an expert on the BC regime. I've not had to give too many bits of advice on the BC regime, but you have had experts in here, one after the other, tout it as a place where you should be looking. And I think it's important that if you put the commissioner, Nancy Bélanger, in charge of your lobbying at the federal level, and she comes in and says, let's look at BC, I think you owe her the respect of looking at BC. She's the expert. But I don't have the answers to you. I don't know exactly the ins and outs of the BC laws.
Going back to that, Ms. Turnbull, please, if you have thoughts.
I would say is that oftentimes we see the provinces taking lessons from the federal jurisdiction, right? Especially in areas like conflict of interest. Oftentimes the provinces are looking at what the feds are doing, and it takes them a while to catch up. And so it's very interesting to see the lobbying commissioner's reflections on best practices at the provincial level. I just want to stress how unusual that is, and to say, if she, to kind of echo Professor Stedman, if she's saying that BC is the model to look at, I think that actually creates a real need to have a look at that. And I think some of the reasons that she did are some of the clarity that's in place there. So, for example, the default registration, right? Like it's just, yes, it's clear what the obligation is. They don't have these spaces where there's a judgment call about whether this requires registration or not, right? Like so I think probably for some of those reasons she's looking at that.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of default legislation, I'd like both of your takes on this. Do you believe that registration by default for in-house lobbyists is necessary?
I think it's better.
Okay. Mr. Stedman?
Yeah, I don't see why you wouldn't want it. I mean, I don't like the significant duties threshold. What's the point? Doesn't serve the purpose of the Act.
Okay. What do you think is the appropriate balance between avoiding unnecessary administrative requirements within the lobbying regime, which many witnesses before this committee have testified is a legitimate activity, as well as ensuring sufficient transparency? How do we strike that balance?
You received a brief from our friends at Gowlings that said they thought that if you made people register too much, it would kind of stop them from openly discussing and getting in there and trying to influence. With respect, I think that's probably reflective of who their client base is. I don't think it actually serves the regime. I think that it's easy. I mean, we have doctors using scribes to give their notes. Like, there's all sorts of ways the Commissioner of Lobbying can make registration quick and easy. We heard the Commissioner from Quebec say, you can call us if you don't want to go online, and we'll do it over the phone. This isn't rocket science. It's not hard. I think the argument that it's too much of an administrative burden is a sign to you that that person is doing a lot of lobbying. And so they're probably the person you want to capture anyways.
You go through your time.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Al-Soud. Madame Goudreau, si tu veux 5 minutes, je peux te donner.
Madame Goudreau, if you'd like 5 minutes, I can give you 5 minutes. Should be more than enough. Thank you. Let's go over a potential case. We see an issue with a contract. Communication is not all clear, and we think that we should look into the contract that was being awarded. I am part of the Government Operations Committee, and we are trying to shed a light on such a situation. Now, should the legislation be applied to that kind of communication? And if you can explain to me what the current situation is.
So this is about a contract? Well, yes. Like this should be subject to the lobbying rules because this is expenditure of public money. And this is about this is about how public money is being used for a public purpose. And if there is people trying to influence the government on who should get that contract and for what, like I understand that there's, if you've got a small contract, there's kind of a circle around contracts that are small enough that you don't need this kind of transparency, and I think that's fair enough. But if you're talking about a large enough contract that that's a significant chunk of change from the public's perspective, then there's nothing wrong with having transparency around it.
Et sinon, si on ne l'applique pas, une communication...
If we don't have that transparency, we often deal with these smaller companies that communicate with these public office holders, and they're going to speak about the call for tender, correct?
Asking questions about a call for tender that's already out there, that's public, and that you have questions about would not be the same as lobbying to get that actual contract. Reaching out to the public office holder and saying, give us that contract, here's all the reasons. That's basically submitting your tender. That would be, I think, where the line needs to be drawn. I think that's where we've been starting to draw it within this committee, is that might be subject to registration. And the line that we always used in Ontario was, err on the side of caution. That's how we advise anyone who thinks, should I register? Err on the side of caution. You have nothing to lose, right, to Professor Turnbull's point. So I think here is another example of a situation where we're looking at contracts, and maybe we didn't think about it before when we put the act together, but now it's present and it's front of mind. So I think it behooves all of you to think clearly about what you want your recommendation to be with respect to contracts.
Puis ma dernière question,
My last question, what do you think about putting one's holdings into a blind trust as the Prime Minister did?
Sorry, just like public office holders broadly? What do I think of blind trust? Just wondering, like, how do you mean?
dans le fond, comment se fait-il?
How is it that we are able to put our holdings into a blind trust so that we don't have to recuse ourselves, and that would make it so that we can still participate in decision making, and there's a direct link with lobbying there. As I did talk about communications at the start of my question.
I think that we want to make, I think that the point of ethics regimes, things like blind trusts, ethics screens, are so that we can enable the participation of people who are elected to public office and want to serve. They're not to prevent or create obstacles to participation. It's about enabling the participation. And so if we need to create those kinds of regimes so that we know that the public interest is being protected from any potential private interest that the person has, that's completely appropriate. We also do not live in some kind of parallel universe where when someone becomes a public office holder, they stop becoming a private person. That isn't true. There is no way to, we're not living in some kind of made-up fairy tale perfect world here. We have to find ways of managing the person's private interests while they have these public responsibilities. And so blind trusts are a way of doing that. And as we know, we don't know, right? When someone enters into a blind trust, who knows? The person might have sold all your stocks and you have no idea. So, that's just the uncertainty you have.
Merci, Madame Goudreau. Dr. Turnbull.
Thank you, Ms. Goudreau.
We have two members from the mighty OGO on this panel today, Madame Goudreau and Madame Bloch. Ms. Bloch, you have 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. As the Chair has indicated, I am not a permanent member of this committee, but nonetheless very interested in the conversation that we're having today, and happen to be one of two members sitting at this table that were parliamentarians when the Federal Accountability Act was introduced and when the Lobbying Act came into force in 2008. And so welcome the opportunity. Saddened to hear that a statutory review hasn't happened since 2012. I think it's important to be updating these acts as much as possible. Otherwise, you end up having to do a lot of catch-up. And I think that I want to comment on something that you stated, Mr. Stedman, in the 4th edition of the Global Corruption, its regulation under international convention, U.S., U.K., and Canadian law and practice. And I believe this was published in 2022, and this can be found in Chapter 11 under Regulation of Lobbying. And you write, lobbying regulation is often enacted in the wake of political scandal. And I think that's often what happens. That is often when we start to scrutinize the laws that we have in place in order to close the loopholes that perhaps have been exploited and to ensure that public confidence in some of the systems and offices that we have put in place is not undermined further. You do go on to say public decision-making and confidence in government stand to benefit from policy that is forward-looking and proactive rather than reactionary, which I think speaks to the point I just made, and hence the need for statutory reviews. And so I guess my question would be this, because you do go on to talk about the American approach. And I don't know if any questions have been asked around this before, but you state that the American approach sets a much higher standard for disclosure. So what would you recommend that needs to be put into our act to try and meet that high standard?
Yeah, I mean, America is a tough thing to talk about now with their ethics laws, but the point being made was the point that we've been making today, which is you register when you're communicating with the government, not when you're communicating more than 32 hours or more than 8 hours, you register. So that's the recommendation I'd come out of that with. And thank you for reading that. That's nice. You might be the first person who's ever quoted it back to me. I think it's important to recognize, too, that when these laws are put in place, we often don't know what's coming down the pipeline. And so they get stress tested every once in a while when something new happens. And this is, we saw that when Trump took office, the American laws were stress tested quite a bit. And right now we have a situation with a prime minister who has holdings that we've never seen before. So we're getting an opportunity to look at what we've done and what we've put in place and ask ourselves, is it fit for purpose when the purposes are changing? And that's not a bad thing. That's what this project of legislative enactment is about. That's why you're here, because your job is to continually tweak around the edges so you can keep up with the times and be ahead of things, right? So I don't think anything's failed, right? This is just a great opportunity to look at what we have and say, have we learned something, and what can we do to make sure we have the right tools in place so that we're not blindsided in the future.
I agree with that. Thank you so much. I want to also ask the question, and just note that when lobbying occurs, obviously, as members of parliament, we have stakeholders and lobbyists ask for meetings all the time. We can become very busy with those meetings. And there's an exchange that's happening. There's the giving and receiving of information. And so I guess my question to you is, would it be important for MPs to also identify when they've been lobbied?
Got 25 seconds or so to respond.
I don't think it's a bad thing. It's a question of workload for the commissioner, whether she can keep up with it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mr. Stedman, in 10 seconds or less.
I agree. I think that's a matter of where you want to put the burden, who has the resources to shield or to shoulder that burden.
Thank you. Mr. Kellaway, you're next for 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and it's great to be here. This is my first, maybe last time on ethics, you never know, but I'm subbing in for MP Chagger. Really appreciate the testimony. Often when I come to testimony and hear from the witnesses, I take these questions and put them aside because in the testimony and the opening remarks, you said something that really tweaks my interest. And there's actually many things, but I have a limited amount of time. So, Dr. Turnbull, you mentioned in your testimony, you said post-employment rules, and that's something to really follow up on. So maybe can I follow up on those, on some of the comments that you wanted to make around post-employment rules? And then I'll go to Professor Stedman for a particular question as well.
Sure. So the post-employment phase being when a person is leaving their role as a public office holder, as a designated public office holder, and they're now going into a new world where, depending on what they want to do, maybe they're going to go into a kind of retirement phase, or maybe they're going to want to engage a different kind of work. And if they do, well, then what is that going to look like and what restrictions are on them? And the point of the post-employment restrictions is to make sure that the public interest is protected. So if you have somebody leaving, if you've got a cabinet minister who wasn't reelected, okay, now they've gone from having this very powerful role inside the government to being a private citizen. And if we put restrictions on them, we do. They should be appropriate. They should be there to protect the public interest, but not any heavier than that. Not to the point that you're discouraging people from wanting to enter public office because they think, I don't know what I'm going to do after my career in the public side is over. And of course, they don't just apply to ministers, they apply to staff, they apply to people inside the public service. And again, we have those things there for a reason. But I think probably if we look around at the countries that we typically compare ourselves to, Canada's actually quite robust in our restriction of the post-employment phase. And even going back to some of the comments about the American jurisdiction, their emphasis, it seems to me, is on disclosure. Mm-hmm. Do what you're going to do, but tell people about it. Yeah. And then it's up to the public to then map on to see if you've done anything wrong.
So in the moment type of thing, as opposed to after the fact. Okay, that's interesting.
Yes, but it's up to the public to say, we don't like what you're doing and we're going to react to that, as opposed to saying the laws prevent you from doing this. Mm-hmm. Yep. And part of the issue they came up with is because Donald Trump, when he came in the first time, decided he's not going to disclose, and then a whole bunch of people decided they weren't going to disclose either, and then, but you don't want to make rules around that.
Totally, and that's totally a different topic altogether in terms of Mr. Trump. 2 minutes. Professor Stedman, I really liked your testimony as well and your answers to the questions in terms of common sense, balanced approach. Fundamentally, at the core of this is influence. It can be money, but it's influence. So when I'm thinking about, I think about my home riding of Cape Breton and Sydney Glace Bay. We talked about it before testimony. And I'm thinking not so much of the bankers or the financiers that may come to government, and God bless them, we need them. But I'm also thinking of the not-for-profit world that I come from. And so I deal with a lot of not-for-profits in Cape Breton and in fact, across the country. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, in terms of the balance and the common sense approach, number one, how best to handle that in terms of making sure that if we go forward with recommendations, that it's covered in a very balanced way. And I guess the second piece is putting rules in place for the not-for-profit. It's often said that culture drives the strategy. So in terms of rules or laws, do you think there's a period that, in particular, not-for-profits would need to learn about the new rules and if they are applied? Because I think that a lot of folks in the not-for-profit world don't have that capacity, but they would need to get that capacity, if that makes sense.
Well, thank you. Many not-for-profits are already subject to these rules.
Yep,
The
okay.
question is then, if you're going to lower the registration threshold to being everyone registers,
Yep.
do you do the same for a not-for-profit?
Yep.
And I completely sympathize with that. You know, I
Yep.
live within the rare disease space in another part of my life, and
Yep.
patient groups form as not-for-profits, and they have no choice but to lobby to find answers to the things that they're dealing with. So I have a lot of sympathy for that question. I think the solution might be that you keep a threshold for some exceptions, right? So for those not-for-profits that are doing health-related, individual kind of charity work, or small not-for-profits, whatever the threshold is that you will decide upon, you could say that there is a baseline number of hours that they would have to meet within their organization before they're required to register. So you could keep the current rules in place for those smaller players because of the value of having them not waste their time on administrative burden, I guess is one way of putting it.
Thank you,
I
Mr.
appreciate
Kellaway.
it. Thank you.
I've got 2 minutes for Mr. Hardy and then Ms. Nathan to tie a bow around this. So, Mr. Hardy, pour 2 minutes, just 2 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Je suis vraiment
Mr. Hardy, 2 minutes. They talk about charity in English, so I imagine in French it would be organisme à but non lucratif. There are good sides to that, but as in any case, there are people who lobby for the right reasons and those who don't. We can talk about a recent situation. The Prime Minister met with Brookfield's Director of Operations without the screen, but it was for a charity. It's as if it was for a completely different reason. How can we have legislation to ensure that we're not skirting the rules by going outside of the scope of the legislation that would require not registering? How can we ensure that we are best using the systems that we have in place? We need to help these charities, I agree on that, but it can't be a means to skirt the legislation.
Do you have a response? Or do you want me to?
Yeah, I agree with that, right? Like, and that's why I come from the perspective of when in doubt, register. Like, you just say it, right? And that way the net catches everything. And again, it doesn't mean that whatever's going on, there's something bad that that's the reason that you need to report it. Like, not at all. It's just a question
Je vais
of
juste
putting it
revenir à l'inverse parce que souvent vous nous dites que les
Often you say people act in good faith, but if somebody is acting in bad faith, they won't register themselves voluntarily to shed a light on the fact that they skirted the legislation. That's what I'm seeking to avoid.
You force someone to register if they don't want to.
Il faut avoir des lois capables de couvrir ça. C'est ça
We
le
need to
point.
have legislations that would do that. If people are using
If you want someone to register and they won't, and they don't want to, and they think they can get away with it, and that's their mindset, they won't do it. And so then the question is trying to catch that person because you think someone's going to rat them out, then you follow up with enforcement. But no piece of legislation is going to force someone to tell you something that they don't want to tell you.
Okay, thank
La
you.
transparence nous permettra au moins de poser des questions.
at least transparency would allow us to ask questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you. Thank you to both of you for being here today. In the quick 2 minutes I have, I just want to talk a little bit about the grassroots lobbying, and there's some recommendations that the Commissioner has given as well. But I want to talk more about like the social media lobbying or the AI or any of the new forms of lobbying that we have. A crowd lobbying where instead of coming together as an organization or a lobby firm, that you have individual people lobbying, but a member of parliament may not want to be associated with them. How do you deal with something like that? And what would be your recommendation for that? And this could be a positive lobbying for something to happen or something not to happen.
Can I ask you to reframe the end of it? The member of parliament might not want to be associated with being lobbied by someone?
Yes, it could be a bill that's going through, and they don't want to really be associated with. It could be a group that is negatively in social media, portraying themselves.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with something like that, or what kind of recommendation can you give for that?
I think as a member, you're allowed to just say no to a meeting, right? And I think what you're saying is you're bombarded with social media, and I mean, that's just the world we live in, unfortunately. I'm not so sure you can avoid that unless you have people on your staff to filter it out, and you're not the one hanging out on Twitter. But I think what underlies your question is a very important topic, which is grassroots, as we know it, is a changing space within the lobbying community. It used to be the case that I put flyers on the side of polls and I told people to go talk to their MPs. Now we can do all sorts of things, including using chatbots and troll farms to do all sorts of things that don't even require a human, right? Your AI reference there. And I think that's a really important topic that we didn't talk about today, but that has come up in your review that you will have to address as far as, do you want more registration on grassroots lobbying? I think Commissioner Motherwell brought it up too, as far as the Ontario law. So it's a good question. But
thank you, Mr. Stedman. Thank you, Ms. Nathan. And if you do have any thoughts on that, Mr. Stedman, and you want to share that with the committee post your appearance here today, I would certainly welcome that on behalf of the committee as well. I do have one question, and Ms. Turnbull, you mentioned this very early on in your intervention about the attraction to the public service of professionals from outside the public service. We're seeing, for example, in the major projects office, we're seeing a secondment going on. Where people are coming in, they're being seconded for perhaps whatever expertise that they may apply to the major projects office. Should we consider as a committee, and I'm not sure that many of them would be designated public office holders, but when they, in post-employment periods, where they return back to the company that they came from, should the committee consider, or should we be concerned with, any leverage that they may gain, any understanding of how government works, any connections that they may make for the purposes of them lobbying post the secondment as they return to whatever company it is that may actually, in fact, be connected in some way to the major projects office for projects that might be built in terms of infrastructure. Should we be concerned or consider that aspect of it? Ms. Turnbull?
Yes, Mr. Chair, you should. And I would also say that it might not show up exactly in terms of what we describe as lobbying, but also information, right? Like not necessarily going back to lobby the government, but maybe they will, maybe they won't. But also in terms of information that they would have gleaned at the time about how things are working, who's in charge, how decisions are being made, what the criteria are. This project got approved under these circumstances, so now this project should look more like that. This is gold. Right? So, yeah, right. I would look at that.
Yeah. Mr. Stedman, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a question for both the Conflict of Interest Act and the Lobbying Act, for sure.
Okay.
Agree.
All right. My only regret is that I didn't book you for 2 hours, because I think you've added a lot of value to the discussion today. So I appreciate the time that you've taken with us. We're going to suspend for a minute while we switch over to our next panel. Thank you both on behalf of the committee and on behalf of Canadians. This meeting is suspended. I'd like to welcome our witness for the second hour today from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Frédéric Pinsance, who is an inspector of sensitive and international investigations. Mr. Pinsance, you've got 5 minutes to address the committee. Please start.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, Chair and honorable members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to appear today as we gather on the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Nation and recognize the continuing presence of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in this region. My name is Inspector Frédéric Pinsance of the Central Region Sensitive and International Investigation Unit. Tout d'abord, j'aimerais prendre un moment pour parler du rôle de la police
First, I
fédérale.
would like to take a moment to speak about the RCMP's federal policing role. Federal policing has a multifaceted mandate with authorities under more than 250 federal statutes and acts of parliament. We enforce federal laws, investigate criminal activity related to national security, transnational and serious organized crime, financial crime, and corruption. Also, we secure Canada's borders and ensure the safety of critical infrastructure, internationally protected persons, other designated persons, and democratic institutions.
Independence is fully respected throughout all investigations. Operational independence underpins the rule of law and is necessary for the maintenance of public trust. While accountable to Parliament, the RCMP is operationally independent. Police independence is an important principle in a free and democratic society that ensures that the government cannot direct or influence the actions of law enforcement, and that law enforcement decisions remain based on the information and evidence available to police. The RCMP ensures that all investigative actions are appropriate to protect the integrity of the investigation and the right of the accused individual, as well as take steps to mitigate any future harm that may occur throughout the investigation. This is a delicate balance that the RCMP faces in all of its investigative efforts. Dans cette optique, j'aimerais maintenant communiquer.
With this in mind, I would now like to share more information with the committee on the area within the RCMP that has the expertise and experience on leading investigations sent to us by the Office of the Commissioner of Lobbying.
The Royal Canadian Mounted Police that is carried out in every province and territory in Canada as well as internationally. As part of its federal policing mandate, the RCMP Sensitive and International Investigation Team investigates sensitive, high-risk matters that may cause significant threats to Canada's political, economic, and social integrity of the institutions of government, public official, the integrity of the Crown across Canada, and internationally. This includes allegation of offenses under the Lobbying Act. L'intégrité de toute enquête criminelle doit être protégée.
The integrity of any criminal investigation must be protected. While subjects of investigation are sometimes known publicly, additional associates to the alleged offenses are often unknown. Knowledge of the suspect, charges, or investigative strategy and techniques can lead to potential destruction of evidence, intimidation of witnesses, and or result in prejudice to an innocent person.
Components has the potential to compromise an ongoing investigation. The RCMP cannot comment on the nature or sources of the information it receives as relating to an ongoing investigation. In the case of enforcement of the Lobbying Act, the RCMP can confirm that it is investigating all associated matters to determine if any criminal offense has taken place. In investigations such as those related to the Lobbying Act, the timeline of these investigations will vary depending on the myriad of factors, including matters of privilege, number of ongoing investigations, and available resources. As a result, the duration of these investigations can vary. Aujourd'hui, je m'engage à vous fournir autant d'informations.
Today, I am committed to provide you with as much information as I can on the RCMP investigative processes. I will answer your questions to the best of my ability, all while protecting the integrity of any ongoing investigation.
Partners and communities for standing with us in protecting those who have given so much to Canada. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you, Inspector. On va commencer avec le premier tour. Monsieur Hardy.
We're going to start with our first round of questions. Mr. Hardy, you have 6 minutes. Thank you for being with us, Inspector. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. I would like for us to talk about foreign interference. In 2024, that was a significant issue. It was, in fact, urgent to act. In 2025, during the election campaign, Prime Minister Carney said that it was the biggest threat, or rather that the biggest threat for us was China. And then there was a strategic partnership with Chinese police. Do you believe that this could lead to potential issues? Is foreign influence still a problem here from China? this goes beyond my area of expertise. My unit is focused only on matters related to fraud and any allegations regarding members of parliament or senators and lobbying investigations. So regarding foreign interference, unfortunately, that is not my area of expertise. But do you not see businesses or foreign interests who would lobby our decision makers? And there are groups who are active here in Canada that might not be doing it officially through diplomacy, and this could lead to potential investigations. Is this currently the case? Again, this is not the kind of investigation that we have carried out under the Lobbying Act. We have carried out some investigations that were sent to us from the Commissioner, but there isn't that element of foreign interference. Well, where do you intervene, if we want to clarify for those who are listening? Often I see comments on social media or people who reach out to me in Montmorency Charlevoix and they say, well, Gabrielle, you see all of this information. Do you think that there might have been lobbying that was not fair? Why is there no investigation? Where do you intervene in the process? Thank you for the question. We can react at different moments. Generally, we'll receive a file that will be referred to us from the Commissioner of Lobbying. Then we examine the information to determine whether or not there was an offense committed, and if the minimal threshold is met, then we will investigate the circumstances. So you are in reaction mode. The Commissioner needs to have looked into it, and we saw this with conflicts of interest, and we see it with lobbying. There might not be the appearance of a problem, so you can't investigate, even though with the information that you received that there could be a potential conflict or potential problem. So you don't investigate until the file is sent to you by the Commissioner. If I look at historical data regarding our previous investigations, there are 24 investigations since 2010, 2012. And of those investigations, 23 of them were referred by the Commissioner's office. However, the RCMP can still investigate in certain situations, and we might detect certain information in those investigations. And so investigators are very aware of potential offenses, and if we determine that there could be an offense, then yes, we will investigate. And if you launch an investigation that would be linked to a minister's office or the Prime Minister's office, for example, the people that you are investigating are those who are giving you the information. Do you have a hard time accessing that information? How do you ensure that the process is as transparent as possible? How do you ensure that you have access to the information, because you're investigating those who are supposed to be giving you the information? So some of the investigations can lead to some challenges regarding having access to the information in order to lay charges. We do have methods at our disposal, thanks to the criminal code, regarding any kind of orders to receive communications and warrants. But we do need to follow the process for having access to evidence, and we have to follow the parameters given to us by the Lobbying Act. I have one final question if I have time, Chair. 40 seconds. I just want to understand the relationship between parliamentarians and the RCMP. If you're investigating an MP or a minister or a prime minister, once that person leaves Parliament, do the investigations end, or do they carry on, and if there were any problematic activities while they were in a decision-making position, will you continue the investigation even if they leave their parliamentary life? Criminal investigations will continue. Nobody is exempt from that, so we will continue an investigation and we will stay within the parameters. Thank you, Mr. Hardy. Ms. Lapointe, 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. This is greatly appreciated. We have already met with the Commissioner. She told us that the RCMP is responsible for investigations. Have you read her recommendations? Yes? I just wanted to be sure, because recommendation 17 for additional measures for compliance, modernizing the legislation to include training, mandatory training, administrative monetary penalties, and temporary prohibitions on lobbying. The Commissioner, when she was here, was saying that when she wants to close or when you close a file, she does not receive the information automatically. She would like to know what happened. She was saying that this is something that she had an issue with. She had to communicate with people that she was investigating 2 or 3 years ago. These people might not still be working, and so she does not know what to do. Thank you very much. I'd like to specify regarding information shared once a file is closed. We do advise the Commissioner's office as soon as a file is closed. I think what the Commissioner was saying had to do with the content of the investigation. We'll give information, general information, and say that the file is closed, but the investigative details, the statements, all of that information stays within the investigation. This information is not shared with her. Thank you. Earlier, my colleague talked about the process. Can you clarify? When does the Office of the Commissioner reach out to you? Generally, once the Lobbying Commissioner has reasonable doubts that an offense was committed under the Act, well, then the file will be sent to us. At that time, we will assess the file, communicate with the individuals. We will confirm the definitions in the Lobbying Act. Are we talking about lobbyist consultant, or we need to ensure that we have all the information to meet the threshold for an investigation. And after that, we will start the investigation. In your opening remarks, you talked about 250 laws that you needed to respect, and you talked about 24 investigations. How many of those were closed? Can you talk about past investigations? Yes, I can give general information on some of those files. As I mentioned, there are 3 active files that I cannot talk about. On those other files, we have some data. So for the past 13 years, there are 2 files that led to charges. One is currently in front of the courts. The other file was closed. If we go a little bit further back, there are perhaps 4 files that ended with charges, and some others didn't meet the minimal threshold to lay charges, or for any other reasons given the parameters that we need to follow. Thank you. Can you give us some details regarding what you generally investigate, and the kind of things that you wouldn't investigate, any topics that you wouldn't investigate. We have received different categories of investigations, and it depends on the offense, the violations that are included in the Lobbying Act. Some of those offenses are, for example, a consultant lobbyist who's not registered. There could be a salaried lobbyist that is not registered. Situations where the Lobbying Act wouldn't allow an individual to lobby, depending on their contract. And we can also investigate that 5-year ban for the designated public office holders who are not supposed to lobby for 5 years. And so that's the kind of offense that we will be investigating. Thank you. We heard about someone who is meeting with an MP in an airport. Do you believe that it's an offense for someone to speak about a bill without it being registered? It depends on the situation. It depends. If we look at sections 5171, they identify the parameters clearly. So a conversation, if it's not seeking payment, or it really depends on the circumstances. Does the discussion have to do with any subjects that are included in the legislation? So this is what we have to look into. So yes, if communication is part of those topics listed in the legislation, well, yes, if we're talking about payment for a third party, then yes. Thank you, Ms. Lapointe. Ms. Gaudreau, 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. 24 investigations. You said that one did not come from the Commissioner? Who can request an investigation? If somebody wants to share allegations, they can communicate with the RCMP. We'll assess the situation to determine whether or not this complaint meets the criteria, and we can establish whether or not an offense was committed. The Lobbying Commissioner's office is the one that has the expertise and all the knowledge. They understand the legislation. That said, if we receive allegations, we will review the information shared. What about restructuring penalties? What would you think of that possibility? In the privacy file, there are other countries that will say that the penalty is a percentage, is percentage based, so it could be 500 or 5 million. So what do you think about amending the matter of the penalties? We're dealing with lobbying legislation now. There are tools that should be available in order to determine the best solution. We want to ensure that people will be following the rules. Regarding additional measures that could be implemented, well, in certain cases, yes, it could be beneficial to see whether or not there was infringement of the Act. Minor offenses could be resolved through monetary penalties or be carried out through an investigation by the Office of the Lobbying Commissioner. And then we could see if a criminal investigation is necessary. What about the request to increase powers? Because if we are to legislate and give more powers to the commissioner, what do you think of that possibility? As I was saying, the commissioner currently, as soon as she has reasonable doubt, the file will be sent directly to us. The RCMP then needs to assess different factors to see whether or not there was a criminal offense. If it's a case of a lobbyist needing to be registered, well, that becomes an offense if they're not registered in time. Is this kind of offense something that we want to have under criminal investigations? In certain cases, maybe. If somebody is truly trying to avoid being registered. So it would allow us to see what kind of offense requires a criminal investigation and what kind of offense could be better resolved through the commissioner. We want people to follow the rules and perhaps have other measures. My last question now. You talked about investigations being relative to your available resources. So what would it lead to if there are administrative penalties or monetary penalties? If we focus more on these lobbying offenses, what would be the impact on your resources? If there are any administrative measures, that won't have an impact on the RCMP. The RCMP really focuses on investigations and subjects that were referred to them for a criminal investigation. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Gaudreau. We're going to move on to the second round of questions. Ms. Block, you have the floor.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Penzance, for joining us today. I am not a permanent member of this committee, but nonetheless very interested in the testimony that you are providing to this committee today. In your opening remarks, you stated that your office or department investigates high-risk matters, and that when you do investigate, the cases have to meet certain minimum thresholds. And so I'm wondering if you could tell this committee what those minimum thresholds or criteria are that have to be met in order for you to begin an investigation.
Question. So what we will do at that moment is we will look at what is the substance of the allegation. We will look at all the criteria, and we will try to assess all the elements of the offense that will be contained within the Lobbying Act. So we will try to establish, is there sufficient information for us to determine that we are meeting that reasonable ground to believe that there has been an offense. And this is our minimum threshold for us to launch an investigation. Now, there are some other factors that we will have to consider. And as I mentioned earlier, in any situation, we will examine the situation to try to determine, is there some exigent circumstances? Are we looking at a very serious transgression of the act? Are we looking at a minor transgression? As I said earlier, the lobbying commissioner is referring all matters to us. So, of course, we're looking at a very wide spectrum of type of offenses. So we have to make an assessment based on the available resources that we have to try to see which one will be prioritized. So, again, Lobbying Act is one of the acts that we enforce among very many.
Thank you. You also mentioned that there are you have challenges accessing information, and so I'm wondering if you would like to speak a little bit to those challenges.
Yes, thank you for the question. When I say challenges, I would have to say that whenever we use some of the tools that are at our disposal, like again, obtaining production order to try to obtain some information from either from a company or from some individuals, some of the challenge that we can have is, again, to obtain such documented, to be able to obtain those orders, we need to meet, again, a certain level of information. We need to meet that threshold of reasonable grounds to believe. At that point, now we can obtain that information. There are some situations, if we cannot meet that threshold, we won't be in the position to really obtain those information. If I refer to the lobbying commissioner, she does have some compulsory powers at her disposal to summons people to provide testimony. In our case, we have to use, those statements have to be voluntary. People cannot be coerced or influenced to provide some statements. So we have to meet those standards that are provided by the criminal law. So,
thank you. One final quick question. Can you advise this committee as to whether the Green Slush Fund and or GC strategies remain under active RCMP investigation?
Again, I'm not going to be in the position to really comment on any information either from an active investigation or on the other matters of some of the other information, other investigation that we have either concluded because of some privacy or because of the law under the Access to Information and Privacy Act. So some information we're not in a position to provide in relation to these matters.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bloch. Mr. Al-Soud, you have 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Monsieur Pessins, thank you for being with us today and for your service to our country. You spoke to this very quickly earlier, but could you walk us through the current process through which the Office of the Commissioner of Lobbying refers matters to your department?
So usually we have excellent relationship with the Office of the Commissioner of Lobbying. So what's going to happen is we'll receive some communication from their office to indicate that they have a matter to refer to us. Again, we will receive, generally we receive a well-written report that contains all their information that and why. Why do they believe that there's been an offense under the legislation? Again, we will do the same exercise to validate that information. Sometimes we have to obtain a little bit more information to try to meet our threshold to launch an investigation. And at that point, we'll, again, as I mentioned, if we meet the minimum threshold, we will launch an investigation.
Could you speak to that threshold? I'm curious what you would consider to be a minimum threshold.
The minimum threshold would be, based on the information that we have reasonable grounds to believe that an offense under the Act has been committed.
My colleague mentioned earlier, quite maybe in passing, that the Federal Commissioner of Lobbying is seeking additional compliance measures, such as the authority to impose monetary penalties or require training. Could you provide examples of situations where a monetary penalty would be appropriate, including the potential amount? I suppose I'm also asking whether there are certain measures you would suggest the Commissioner should have.
Thank you for the question. As far as exactly which one, I would have to say that would be a decision based on the recommendation of this committee as far as which offenses should be looked at with a criminal lens, or which one should be looked at with some alternate options, such as administrative monetary penalties. In my opinion, when we look at the wide spectrum of potential offense, again, not registering is an offense under the Act. Do we want to capture everyone who's late into registering into a situation? There could be other cases that are referred to us because there might be either a lack of training or some bad information that's been provided to someone. Again, the Office of the Lobbying Commissioner possesses incredible expertise in terms of training and being able to provide some advice when it comes down to what should be and what should not be. So, to me, in my opinion, I would see a value for this committee to examine exactly which one should be comprised within, which one should be investigated from a criminal aspect, and which one should be looked at with some alternate measures.
It's interesting, there's a delicate balance between flexibility on this front and rigidity. There's value in having both of those matters involved in the system. From a compliance measure standpoint, could you explain which measures, mandatory training, would be more suitable, when it would be more appropriate to refer a matter to the RCMP or other provincial regulators?
Again, when it comes down to referring matters to some provincial regulators. Again, this is something that I believe the commissioner has mentioned before when it comes down to the capacity. When it comes down to her capacity to refer matters, right now she has to refer the matter to law enforcement. So again, in this situation, if the mechanism to share information at different level, although I'm not an expert on this front, but I think the Act should have to possess some of those mechanisms for the lobbying commissioner to be able to refer matters maybe to some other instances as opposed to solely law enforcement.
You mentioned earlier that a referral is typically made to you when they have reason to believe there's been a criminal offense. When a referral is typically made from the Commissioner of Lobbying to law enforcement, are they generally timely and sufficient in evidence? What does the fulsome scope of what you see from the Commissioner of Lobbying look like?
Yes, we've received several referrals from her office in the past years, and I've said that so far we've investigated all of them. I would have to say that the information that her office has provided is quality information that contains the information that it's well reasoned and allowed us to conduct investigation. Now, the conclusion of our investigation, of course, will sometimes differ based on a variety of information. So any investigation will be different. We have to meet, it's all based on the information that we can obtain, the means for us to obtain that information, and so that's why sometimes the conclusion may change based on our capacity to investigate.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Al-Soud. Inspector. Madame Goudreau, vous avez 5 minutes.
You have 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Now, regarding some of the measures that can be implemented, perhaps it would be relevant for the commissioner to be able to look at smaller offenses instead of having to send everything over to the RCMP. Is this something that you would support? This is up to the committee to decide with their recommendations, but what do you think? I do see some advantages. There are some more minor offenses that could be managed more quickly, and this would allow the office of the commissioner to give more information, and this could help with transparency of information as well. So, smaller offenses could be dealt with by the commissioner with your support if needed. Yes, if it's to ensure compliance. If we're talking about more serious offenses, where there's the intention, well, then that kind of case could be sent to the RCMP for an investigation. We have to avoid working in silos. And how could we assist the various commissioners, for example, conflict of interest commissioner, lobbying commissioner? Do you work together if there's an intention to commit an offense in order to seek advantages through a blind trust and without recusing oneself? Is this something that you're already doing? Or is it something that you could do? There is some independence between government agencies. Once there is a criminal investigation that is ongoing, we carry out the investigation. We use some of the information that was given to us. We need to be very vigilant regarding that information. As I mentioned earlier, the commissioner does have mandatory powers that she can use, but some of them are not admissible. But my question is as follows. Some commissioners work together, and if they send a request to you, you could investigate something that is not only regarding not registering for lobbying. It could go beyond that. There can be cooperation with the different agencies. If they want to share information with us, as I said, we need to be very vigilant. Our investigations need to be completed according to the Criminal Code and the Charter of Human Rights. So there are parameters that we need to follow. We receive information, and if the legislation says that there's a correlation between these actions, well, anything is possible as long as you follow the different legislation. Yes, because there are cases, previous cases, administrative cases that were sent over to the criminal side. So yes, we work together according to case law. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Gaudreau.
Minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you. How can the public be confident the RCMP investigates independently when we plainly saw that the Prime Minister Trudeau was able to obstruct the investigation into his obstruction of justice by the SNC-Lavalin?
Thank you for the question. Again, the RCMP operates within the framework of the parameters that are provided to us. We have to follow the law that are in place in Canada, and we have to follow these processes. So there are some mechanisms in place that protects some information, either by way of solicitor-client privilege, parliamentary privilege. So we have to operate within those parameters.
With respect to the current Prime Minister, we've observed the trail of Brookfield international contracts coincides with the Prime Minister's international itinerary. How does the RCMP investigate undocumented lobbying by foreign nationals or undocumented lobbying when the Prime Minister is lobbied out of country?
Again, for us to launch an investigation, again, we need to meet. We need to ascertain that the communication were in fact captured by the Lobbying Act. So it is a very difficult question to. We could speculate quite a bit as far as what is the nature of those communication. If we still need to meet that threshold of that evidence. So again, we can't make some inference in terms of location. We would need some evidence to believe that those communication took place.
So there is evidence. When the Prime Minister was in China, he signed a strategic partnership with the communist regime there. How would the RCMP investigate the undocumented lobbying that obviously occurred before the Prime Minister left Canada? Because they didn't decide that they were going to allow 49,000 Chinese-made cars into Canada just during the course of that meeting. Obviously, lobbying had to happen.
Again, I would be speculating. We would need some information for us to be, some more information for us to be able to make a determination. Okay, so the Prime Minister is appointing former business associates. For example, the new CEO of the Defense Investment Agency. That puts the former business associates in a position to lobby on behalf of associates without documenting interactions. And when they're done their term, they go back to business. What can be put in? What do you need to be put in place so that you can investigate how these deals are happening while the people are in office? Again, it's up to the determination of this committee to make some recommendation to increase the parameters that we currently have into the Lobbying Act.
Are there even any concerns that foreign interests are influencing the government and public office holders without that transparency needed?
Again, my answer would be that those parameters would need to be determined by this committee to try to determine exactly, is this what we want to be captured into the Lobbying Act? For us, we really look at the situation. We will assess the evidence that we have, and we will make a determination if we can lay charge in relation to potential offense. There's a lot of communication right now that might not be captured within the Lobbying Act. Those are not offenses if they are not. Again, in situation where if it doesn't meet those criteria, as I mentioned earlier, like is it for payment? Is it in relation to a subject matter? There could be a lot of communication. If they do not meet these criteria, they will not be an offense under the Act.
Should there be tools or parameters for the RCMP and our security agencies to proactively initiate reviews and investigate cases of unreported lobbying or foreign entities using leverage to influence public office holders?
Again, if it's the will of this committee to determine that this is something that should be to increase the transparency, if this is included now into the Lobbying Act as an offense, at that point, the RCMP will be happy to investigate.
Have you seen any evidence that there is currently a functioning foreign lobbyist registry that you could act upon?
Again, I would not have any information in that regard.
Okay, thank you.
Next, we go to Mr. Kellaway for 5 minutes. And then after that, we'll go to Mr. Hardy for 5, and then we'll return back and conclude with another 5-minute round. Go ahead, Mr. Kellaway.
Thank you, Chair. Recommendation 18 refers to situations where the Commissioner of Lobbying believes a matter may be addressed by another appropriate authority, such as a provincial lobby regulator. Are you able to comment on that? If so, what are your views on that?
And this is not really my area of expertise. We really focus on the investigation there at the federal level. So if there's a more efficient way there to refer matters to other instances, this is not a situation that we've encountered.
Well, that's fair. What is the typical length of a post-conviction lobbying ban?
I'm sorry,
What is the typical length of a post-conviction lobbying ban?
Oh, the ban, I would say, the Commissioner of Lobbying does have the power. So once we have an investigation, once an individual has been convicted, at that point, the Commissioner of Lobbying has the ability at that point to issue another ban into to lobby. I'm not extremely familiar, but I believe we could be looking at 1 year into potentially 1 year, but I'm speculating here.
Thank you. So I've married into a police family, and I know there's certain things you can't say, and you can talk in generality, so I can appreciate that. I'm wondering, you talked earlier on about the relationship with the Commissioner of Lobbying and that you have a good relationship. And I'm not asking you to give specifics, but can you kind of walk through if there's a disagreement, like if you have a difference of opinion, kind of give us a flair for that kind of discussion? Because I think it helps inform what recommendations either will be upheld here or amendments that would be made in terms of how is that sorted out? Can you kind of give us a glimpse without giving us an actual example with names?
When it comes down to the relationship with their office, I would have to say that I believe there's a mutual respect between our two offices. We have to operate within a different standard when it comes down to the level of the threshold of proof of evidence that we require. So, of course, lobbying commissioner will look at a matter, and of course, as per the Act, the moment that she forms her grounds to believe that there is a potential violation of the offense, at that point, the file will be referred to the RCMP to investigate. Now, when we look at it, where we sometimes may differ is on the assessment as far as what are the circumstances, and then again, at this stage, the RCMP does have the information in relation to the specific of the offense, and of course, at that point, this is what forms the basis of our conclusion. So again, I believe that we each operate within our own limitation when it comes down to the Act. As it comes down for our investigation, we have to We have to evaluate what it is. We have to function within some of the terminology and the notion. To give an example that was mentioned earlier, when the notion of the significant part of duties, which again, it's a notion that we have to navigate. I know the Act allows for the Commissioner of Lobbying to provide some interpretation bulletin, but again, we have to, in the context of the investigation, we have to assess everything. Interpretation bulletins do provide some parameters for lobbyists to operate. However, when it comes down to the application of the law, we have to function specifically as it relates to what is contained in the Act. And right now, the Act does not speak of 20%. Those are interpretation bulletin, which are not statutory instrument, and as such, not binding in court. So, of course, we have to operate within what is a significant part of duties, to provide an example, which could be very challenging and complex to do.
Mr. Chair, how much time do I have left?
Just less than a minute.
Okay. And very much in the similar vein of the importance of police independence. When issues of lobbying come out, surprise, surprise, on all sides, there's political, we're in a political atmosphere here. So I'm just wondering, how do you ensure, and I think it kind of builds on your previous statements, but if you can add some color to it, how do you maintain that integrity and that independence to ensure that it's the facts, it's the evidence, it's not necessarily a spin that may come out of Ottawa with any particular party?
Well, thank you for the question. No, we do take any allegations very seriously, and we take a measured approach into each specific case. We look at what the elements, what's the evidence before us, and we will make a determination at that point. So these investigations are conducted in private. That information is contained within the investigative team, and we ensure that the information is protected, such to protect the integrity of the investigation, and to make sure that at the same time we are looking in some situation we have to consider the potential repercussion that could have on an innocent person.
Okay,
Thank you.
Monsieur Hardy pour 5 minutes.
This is very interesting. There were many scandals in the past years. For example, SNC Lavalin, Arrive Can, green slush funds. Can we have an example of the consequences? So you investigated. Were there any consequences? Arrive Can was $450 million spent on a company of 4 people working from a basement. Regarding these consequences, they can lead to different resolution mechanisms. There could be administrative measures used by the government in order to recuperate certain funding that had been awarded in a way that was not compliant. The RCMP looks into whether or not there was an offense committed according to the legislation. I don't want to cut you off, I apologize, but I would like an example, because people are always asking about what's happening, and there are a lot of theories, and you'll see where I'm going here. I know that you have processes to respect, but often what we hear here is that it's up to the committee to decide how the RCMP can apply the legislation. But I'll give you an example. We just reviewed the Conflict of Interest Act at the Ethics Committee. We sent a report, but all of the recommendations are being rejected by the Liberals, and they now control committees. So we're stuck in a bit of a loop. We propose things. If they're not accepted by the committee, well, nothing changes. And we end up in this loop. So how can we give you more powers? Could you say, well, we look at this, we should act, and you'll say, we're not going to wait for the commissioner? Or do you always have to wait to receive the go-ahead to investigate? In certain situations, we'll carry out an investigation. We'll look at the different situations that are of the of public interest. We'll determine whether or not these allegations meet the minimum criteria to start an investigation. In other cases, we wait. Can we have any concrete examples where you can say to Canadians, it's not political, I have a concrete example of something that happened in the past years? Again, we use the resources that we have through the criminal code to see whether or not we have the evidence that we need. If we can reference a specific situation, if there was an increase of costs to a program, that's not necessarily a criminal situation. If there was poor management of public funds, that's not necessarily a criminal matter. There are mechanisms in place for the government for non-criminal behavior where the government could recuperate that money. But we focus on criminal investigation, so we focus on the evidence as defined by the Act. So we want to see whether or not we have enough evidence to lay charges. And again, we need to operate within the parameters that are at our disposal. I'll end on a simple question. I respect your work, and I have a lot of friends who are in a similar service. Do you think that we focus too much on the details? Should our ethics not be stricter than our rules necessarily? You say that there might have been shortcomings, but it might not be a criminal matter. Should we legislate further on the ethics that should be at the foundation of our legislation instead of focusing on the smaller details? I'm not a lawyer, but if I look at the Conflict of Interest Act, Parliament's goal was not to criminalize some of that behavior. When we look at that legislation, if the Ethics Commissioner believes that there was an offense, according to the criminal code, he has to suspend his investigation and send it to police agencies, and then we'll carry out an investigation. We need to follow the parameters, and they're going to take more time. We need to carry out our investigations. We need to go through it step by step, whether it be with the assessment, the investigation, or at the end. We need to follow the parameters. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you. Thank you, Mr. Hardy, for being here today. Oh, sorry, not Hardy. The RCMP officer, thank you. My question is about, in the last 15, 16 years, there's been about, why out of the 30 cases that were referred to the RCMP, only 6 individuals were charged with offenses under the Lobbying Act? I think it's between 2009 and last year.
Yes, several investigation. Again, we looked at all of those matters. There has been some challenges within some of the notion within the legislation. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the significant part of duties could be very difficult to quantify. Again, while there are interpretation bulletin mentioned into the Lobbying Act, again, as I mentioned, those are not statutory instrument, and they're not binding. Again, we have to operate within what the legislation is, the way it's written. So again, these could be challenging for us to meet that threshold to be able to lay some charges in this situation.
And so when the commissioner suspends her investigation because she has referred the case to the RCMP, and the RCMP subsequently closes the file without charging, there's effectively a regulatory vacuum where neither office can act meaningfully. how frequently does this scenario occur? And in your view, what institutional reforms would prevent accountability from falling through the gap entirely?
Again, it could be in the legislation, maybe to include some parameters in which information could be shared with the Office of the Lobbying Commissioner. But then again, it would need to be examined to try to ensure that information, that capacity to share information with her office would be in respect with other legislation that's in place, like the Access to Information Act or the Privacy Act, and so on.
And like Bill C8 now before the Parliament requires critical infrastructure sector to implement cybersecurity programs and mandatory incident reporting, reflecting on a broader legislative philosophy that graduated compliance tools are more effective than relying solely on criminal enforcement. Does the RCMP believe a similar graduated approach, which could potentially include the commissioner having access to more administrative penalties, mandatory training, and temporary ban before criminal referral, would this procedure better compliance outcomes in a lobbying context, do you feel?
Again, personally, I feel that yes, there could be some value to examine the options to provide more options for the Commissioner of Lobbying to be able to have more discretion in which matters should be investigated by her office and which matters should be referred to the RCMP.
And have you made these recommendations already? And I know the report came out, but I was just wondering if you were able to give these inputs in.
As far as recommendation, again, like these this is mostly formed from our experience into these investigations. I think the Office of the Commissioner of Lobbying is better suited to provide some recommendation based on information and the result from our investigation when it comes down to the specific offenses in question. So I believe that her office is better suited to provide the recommendation. But again, I was happy to share our experience as it comes to our investigations.
Okay. And what are some of the reasonable grounds that the commissioner consider before she refers something to the RCMP that you think is fair?
I would say essentially is what is the definition of the communication? So in that situation, did the communication meet the requirement of the legislation? If they are, and there's an offense that's been established at that point, she will refer the matter. So to give an example specifically, if someone has been lobbying, there's evidence to support that someone has been lobbying and they were subject to a ban, at that point, if she forms her grounds to believe that there's a violation there under that section, then she will refer the matter to us. Again, we will make our own assessment of that information, and if we agree, we will again launch an investigation.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Nathan. Inspector, I want to thank you for your appearance on this very important study in front of committee today. I also want to thank you on behalf of the committee and Canadians for your service as well to our nation, and I appreciate you being here today. Thank you so much. Just before we go, I'm just going to advise the committee that you'll be receiving notices for next week's meetings. We're going to be dealing with the main estimates. We've got the Information Commissioner and the Ethics Commissioner coming on Monday, the Privacy and Lobbying Commissioners both coming on Thursday. So with no other business in front of us, this meeting is adjourned.